All right, hello everybody. As Jane mentioned, my name is Adam Grearson, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the necessity of support. But you'll start to see why I've entitled my talk "The Necessity of Support," and ultimately the larger title, the meta title, with a little help from my friends. Before I start, I'd like to kind of outline three basic pillars that I believe everybody needs to have access to, especially people who go through, like myself, who end up having mental health issues. And the three pillars that everybody needs include a friend, a job, and a home or a house. And the issue I basically had with this was all three of my pillars were threatened in the course of probably a couple of years. And it all compounded into one really powerful moment for me, which was a decisive point during my diagnosis, or before I was diagnosed. So basically, a little bit about myself. Have been diagnosed with psychosis, schizophrenia, and depression. Psychosis and schizophrenia go together hand in hand. One's usually an issue with the other. Like psychosis is a symptom of schizophrenia. And it all began when I was in my late teens. So I was probably 17, 18 when my issues started to come out. I started to have my first pillar of friends being threatened. So I inadvertently began to alienate myself when I was in my later years in high school from a lot of friends I had. And basically what happened here was I was going through two different types of delusions that are a caricature or a specific symptom of schizophrenia. I had delusions of grandeur, in which I became really arrogant. I thought I was a very important person. And then I started to have some delusions of persecution, in which I thought everybody was out to get me and harm me. So because of these delusions, I started to get into pointless arguments with people. Essentially, as I mentioned, I alienated myself from a lot of my friends, and I started to become more of a lone wolf type person. And I had kind of been like that most of my life, but it was exacerbated to an extreme by this point. So when that started to happen, I wasn't really sure what was going on. I didn't think there was anything I was doing wrong. I just thought, oh, it's not me, it's everybody else. It must be what it is. So I just kept on going about my business, and things just seemed to get worse from there. So things continued on. I started to get quite depressed because I'm not really sure what the reason was for it. Like some people will say, oh, there's a chemical issue in the brain going on. Other people will say, well, you can have certain life situations happen that can trigger something like that. I'm not exactly sure of the root cause of it, but things just started to kind of compound, and one thing led to the other, things fed into each other. So during my grade 12 year of high school, I became increasingly depressed. I had a lot of issues with sleeping. I didn't want to do anything. And interestingly enough, I didn't really pull back from activities, which a lot of people who are depressed will do. I ended up just throwing myself into more activities as a way of dealing with it. So I would be in my high school until probably 11 or 12 at night, and getting a ride home with a custodian that I knew there, who I had talked with, and doing work for extracurricular components like the yearbook, or working on school assignments or stuff like that. And I just thought that was normal. And a lot of people I talked to said that wasn't normal, but I just, it must be you, not me. This is my life. Yeah. So I started doing stuff like that. I was still doing really well in school. My grades never were jeopardized. I was very fortunate in that respect. I was always a high-performing student in high school. And I continued to be that even during the mental health issues that started to manifest at this point. So that started to happen, and it just got worse. I was kind of confused about what I wanted to do with my life. I knew I wanted to go to university, but I wasn't sure how I was going to structure it and what the method would be to go, or the path would be to going there. So I knew I wanted to do it, but I wasn't ready at the time. So after my grade 12 year, I took a victory lap, or a fifth year, as it's sometimes called. And that just made things worse, unfortunately. So the depression became worse, the alienation from friends became worse, and then between that victory lap year and then a gap year I took after that, in which I was just working at Dollarama at the time in Trenton, I experienced a lot more difficulty in the fact that my second pillar was threatened. So my job was threatened. It wasn't one of those things where it was, oh my God, I've lost everything. It was the kind of thing where my behavior at work started to become a bit more erratic, a bit more, I was even more aggressive with certain coworkers when I really didn't need to be. And I was pulled aside by a supervisor one day, and she kind of gave me a bit of a talk saying that my performance hasn't been the same. And I thought, well, it can't be me. Like, what's going on here? It must be caused by something else. So I kind of just thought about that and then pushed it aside. And then one day, in about 8 years of work, I've only ever called in sick 3 times. One of those times, I was talking to my boss on the phone, and she kind of said, well, I'd like to know it was on topic, but it was unexpected for me. She said, I'd like to know where the old Adam is. So that was a bit of a trigger warning for me there, and that's when I started to really think about things and wonder, well, what's going on? So I had thought at that point that I was in risk of losing my job because I had been spoken to by a supervisor. My boss was asking where the old Adam is. So I was really concerned about that. And then during my gap year, things became increasingly worse between myself and my mother. And that was the peak of the hard time. Was one night I thought she was essentially kicking me out of the house because I was still living with her. And she wasn't doing that at all. We were just going through a very heated argument, and she basically said, well, we'll talk about this in the morning. We'll sleep on this and figure it out again in the morning. The warning signs went on for me. I thought, oh man, I'm being kicked out of the house. So I completely freaked out, and this is when I started to hallucinate, which is another characteristic of schizophrenia. I started to have suicidal thoughts and like voices in my head telling me that I need to kill myself. So this scared me. I had some thoughts of suicide before, during my grade 12 year when I was really depressed, but it wasn't voices telling me I should do it. It was more me reasoning something out, as in, if I commit suicide, this will stop the bad stuff from happening and I won't have to suffer. But now I was actually hearing voices in my head telling me, Adam, you need to kill yourself. So I didn't know what to do. I ended up calling some teachers I knew in high school really well, and I got a hold of one of them who was a law teacher, and he ended up telling me, when I asked him what I had to tell the police versus what I didn't have to, he told me I didn't have to say anything. So I felt more comfortable knowing that I didn't have to really say what was going on. I just needed to say something was wrong, and I'm afraid that I might hurt myself or commit suicide. So I called the police, and this was the turning point for me in my diagnosis before my diagnosis, the turning point in my mental health struggle when I realized something is really up. So I called the police. They came, they took me to the hospital after I told them I was having suicidal thoughts, or suicidal ideation as it's commonly referred to. And I ended up spending 3 weeks in the hospital, during which I was diagnosed with psychosis, schizophrenia, and depression, as I had mentioned. And I was put on a heavy cocktail of drugs. So I was on 7 different types of medication when I left the hospital. And when I first met with the psychiatrist I would see for a regular amount of time after the hospital, he cut it down to 2. So it was kind of a bit of a drop in 5 medications was pretty big for me. But I came out of the hospital, I started seeing a therapist, and this is when things started to get better. The medication really started to work for me, and it started to take care of my hallucinations. I have chronic symptoms, so I still have hallucinations every now and again, but it's minuscule. It rarely happens, but I accept that it's normal for me, that it will sometimes happen. But I came out of the hospital, I was on medication, I started seeing a therapist, I was meeting with a psychiatrist to check in and see how things are going and get my medication to make sure that's on board with where it should be. And this is part of the reason why I've entitled this talk, With a Little Help from My Friends, The Necessity of Support. Because the reason where I am today and doing what I am right now is largely and is basically overwhelmingly because of my supports. And I use the word support in a very broad sense. Basically anybody who has helped me in some way in dealing with my illness. So I accept that I have been diagnosed. I always tell people I have schizophrenia. I don't always say the psychosis or depression part, because I think my depression was more episodic. I had it at that one point really before going to the hospital, and I haven't really had much of it since then. But my schizophrenia is chronic. I will have it for the rest of my life. And these supports have helped me deal with everything. So meeting with a therapist and talking about how life is going and what's working for me, what's not working for me, and figuring out an action plan to try and get life from, if it's here in the middle, to get it up here to being great, the therapist has helped me with that. And One of the ways, not only have the supports helped me, but I basically found a way, a coping mechanism by throwing myself into stuff. And a warning sign could go on here, oh, well, you did this during high school when you were going through your psychosis and you started doing a whole bunch of stuff then. But I did this in a more constructive manner. So I was diagnosed with my illnesses in April of 2009. And I basically, the same year, 4 months after, I threw myself back into school and I started going to Loyalist College in Belleville on a part-time basis. And basically about 2.5 months, 3 months, somewhere around that period after I was in the hospital, I went back to work, working at Dollarama. And ever since, those have become my two biggest priorities, academics being the number one priority in my life, and then my job being my second priority. And this has been my coping mechanism by throwing myself into things I really enjoy doing, has helped me overcome a lot of the issues I'm having. I'm not going to say that everything is perfect because I don't think anybody has a perfect life, but I am doing very well right now considering what I could be doing with having this diagnosis. Considering the fact that there are statistics out there to say that a lot of people who have schizophrenia, the rate of people who have schizophrenia who are in the workforce isn't very high. So I'm very fortunate to be where I am, and it's because of these supports. It's because of my bosses who I've had, the one I had in Trenton, then I transferred to the Dollarama here in Peterborough. If it weren't for these bosses, first my one in Trenton taking me back after I was in the hospital and welcoming me back with wide open arms, no questions asked, and completely supportive in every way, shape, and form. If it weren't for the fact that I had access to the SOAR office in Loyalist College, which is the Student Office for Alternative Resources, or Alternate Resources, it's like Trent's Accessibility Services office, but it's the Loyalist College version. Without having a check-in person there to say how my marks are going and talk about my strategies for approaching assignments and how I'm coping with everything, my illness and the demands of school, I would not have created a spot and maintained the spot on the dean's list that I did both years there. And if it weren't for the fact that the Accessibility Services office here, and most importantly out of my experience there, my academic advisor Jennifer Lund, who will be speaking shortly, I would not be where I am now, having been a student who's been on the dean's list every year at Trent I've been here. So my supports have been a huge factor in my success, and the support I've left for last, which is the most important one, I like to say the best for last sometimes. It's more fun that way. Bit of suspense. Is my mother, and we went through some really hard times, and I acknowledge that. I know I didn't say some terrible things during my psychosis, and we had some really pointless arguments, but she always stood by me, and that support there has been incredible for the fact that not everybody has that happen when people have mental health issues. So her support has been unbelievably powerful and is the number one reason I am where I am. So essentially, to quote a Beatles song that I have taken quite a liking to, with a little help from my friends, here I am today. Thank you very much.